We are going to be talking about the Matt Damon, Ridley Scott movie, The Martian, which everybody knows and loves. And we're going to start right off with a tough question about leadership. What does The Martian show us about taking the right level of personal responsibility?
This movie really is a good one to talk about if we're talking about what does responsibility mean? What does personal responsibility mean? Because we get this example of Matt Damon's character, who by all by all math basically is left for dead, right? Like his team doesn't even know he's left on this planet. If he were to calculate the odds of survival, his odds of survival are like so many zeros and then a one or whatever. There's not a lot of an opportunity for him to make it here. But right from the beginning, we get this statement of responsibility from Mark. He says, "I'm not going to die here." And that ownership is really, really interesting because obviously he's an astronaut. He's, the best of what humanity has to offer potentially. So he's going to be a hard worker. He's going to be somebody who's determined. He has to be in order to have made it that far. So that makes sense. But there's something more here because it's really challenging for each of us to consider what the right level of responsibility to take in a situation is. So, Brian, something that comes up to me pretty often, whether it's when I'm mentoring somebody, I mean, this could come up in a business context. There's many different ways that this comes up. This comes up for me personally in my relationships as well. It's this question of what is the right level of responsibility to take? Because you can take this on one side, and we're going to use a model from M. Scott Peck here from the work, The Road Less Traveled. Classic M. Scott Peck seminal work. Amazing, amazing book. Now, some of the terminology may have changed and some of the understanding from a psychology perspective has evolved. But the core concept here is like what it means to be human. And I love it so much. But Peck has this spectrum in this book, and it's all about neurosis versus having a character disorder. And that character disorder is kind of like a general way of describing personality disorders that tend toward deflection. So on one side of the spectrum, we have neurosis, which is everything is my fault. Anytime something happens, I'm the one that's to blame. I should have done better. And as a result, I have very little self-confidence.
Well, and you get paralyzed, right? Like like well, if it's all on me, and I couldn't possibly handle all of it, right? And so then you're just like you're locked up with fear of screwing up.
Yeah, exactly. And we see a little bit of an example of this at the beginning with the commander, Jessica Chastain's character, who has the kind of like she's trying to direct the whole team in that opening scene, but she's getting a little bit paralyzed and locked up because she's also trying to put all of the responsibility on herself in the moment because she
Mm-hmm.
feels responsible for Mark, the team member. It's not a bad thing. It just kind of results in her getting locked up.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other side is the character disorder, and we all, have tendencies this direction, or probably know people who are really far in this direction. The deflection personality, which is to say nothing is my fault, and I should just be getting a raise. I should just be getting a promotion, regardless of the actual requirements of what it would take to do that next job. It's always somebody else's fault. It just was a
Right.
bad year for our business, so I didn't get a raise. Sorry, family. It had nothing to do with my own personal responsibility in driving the business forward or anything like that.
Right. So, okay. So I want to circle back here because this is really good. So we've got these kind of personality dichotomies of ways to respond to a crisis or ways to respond to a situation. We've got the it's all my fault. Oh my god, what am I going to do? And we've got the it's somebody else's fault. Woe is me. I'm going to I'm going to blame the world and weep and wail and gnash my teeth. Right. So we love analogies on WonderTour. I love this movie because it's both so ridiculous and so relatable, right? Like I have never personally been trapped alone on an entire planet with, where I was certainly going to starve to death or suffocate. Like I haven't had that problem. But I think we've all had the like, you know, this is all on me. I'm out here by myself. I've been marooned by my team. Nobody knows my struggle. Nobody knows the trouble I've seen. Like we've all kind of been in that like Mark Watney, like I really feel like I'm on an island here. I feel like I'm on a planet apart from everybody else, and I've got this insurmountable pile of problems. And so both of these personality disorders, like, they're both dead ends in one way or the other, right? You is the how am I ever possibly going to solve this problem doesn't really help you. And also, like, it's everybody else's fault and I got, this is deeply unfair also doesn't really help you. And so this, the middle way, to coin a phrase, the path down the middle is what we see Mark Watney doing, right? Is the I'm not going to die here. The very first recognizable step is the I'm not going to accept this situation, right? I will do what I can to get out of this situation. And I don't know all of the steps between me and getting out of here. Like, I have no idea how I'm going to get back to my family on Earth. Like, that's not, I know that that's the long term goal, but I'm not going to worry too much about trying to build a Gantt chart between me and there, right? All I'm trying to do is, like, what can I do right now that takes a step in that direction? I think that's very relatable, and that's very much like when you recognize yourself in that situation, when you recognize yourself on, like, I feel like I'm alone, I feel like I've been really put in a bad situation, I feel like I'm doomed to, like, okay, fine, anyway, that's the situation, great. What resources do you have available to you? What can you do next? Like, step one, patch the hole in your spacesuit, right? Step one, don't bleed to death, right? Don't stay actively on fire. What can you do right now to get yourself stabilized? And then so once you get out of that, like, immediate, like, I'm actively in pain and I'm in crisis stage, like, then what?
Well, I want to take one step back even further than that, because I think we can learn a lot from Mark Watney. And also, I think that, like, how do you even take responsibility in the first place? And how do you take a healthy amount of responsibility? I just have to read the opening paragraph from The Road Less Traveled
Oh,
by
let's do it.
Peck.
Yeah, let's
It's
do it.
so good here, because this is the really how M. Scott Peck lays out the first step to taking responsibility. And this is, I've gone back to this so many times, the first page of this book. Life is difficult. This is a great truth, one of the greatest truths. It's a great truth because once we truly see this truth, we transcend it. Once we truly know that life is difficult, once we truly understand and accept it, then life is no longer difficult. Because once it's accepted, the fact that life is difficult no longer matters. Most people do not fully see this truth that life is difficult. Instead, they moan more or less incessantly, noisily or subtly, about the enormity of their problems, their burdens, and their difficulties, as if life were generally easy, as if life should be easy. And then later on, he says, life is a series of problems. Do we want to moan about them or solve them? Do we want to teach our children to solve them? Discipline is the basic set of tools we require to solve life's problems.
Well, that's almost a quote from the movie, right? Like, that's really cool. And I think that's actually that answers my question really well, right? Is that there's a reaction state, like when you get punched in the face, when you get, left at the side of the road with a flat tire, right? Your first step is just the sort of patching the bleeding, right? Just make sure that you're, kind of stable enough to look around and understand your situation, to take stock of where you are. And where you are might be really dire. Like, then that's when you take stock, then you have the opportunity for despair. And that's really when the responsibility kicks in, right? When you're just reacting, when you're just trying to, just trying to get your head above water, you often don't necessarily have the time or the perspective to, like, try to, to zoom out. But once things quiet down a little bit, that's where the responsibility lands, is that nobody else is going to do this for you. Nobody else is going to look at your world and decide actually what's going on and which parts of it are not meeting your expectation, and that's just the deal. Like, that's just the deal you've got right now. Weeping and wailing about it, bemoaning it, is not going to get you out of there. Solving one problem at a time, hopefully with your magical science powers, right? Hopefully with your extraordinary hyper competence and confidence, would be great, right? We're not all going to be Mark Watney, but to solve one problem at a time, and if you solve enough problems, that's really powerful. Like, the idea that there is potentially a chain of solutions that will get you there, and that if you are willing to face head on what the problem is, you're more likely to solve the correct problems.
Yeah, that's really good. Because going back to our question, right? What is the right level of responsibility to take? Well, the answer to that question is not, it's both simple and difficult.
Mhm.
It's first to understand that pain is necessary for growth, that suffering is a part of the process, and thus, what is the most pressing problem for me to solve? Not what is the easiest problem for me to solve, right? Not what is the most enjoyable problem for me to solve, but what is the most pressing problem for me to solve? And we see that right at the beginning. Obviously, he has to solve this problem, right? But he has to pull the he has to pull the spike out from himself, and then he has to dig in immediately before he like sits down and rests or anything else. He's like, all right, now I have to like pull the metal out of my body, otherwise all of these other things are going to be pretty meaningless if I'm too weak to be able to actually go out and explore and gather the data and the information that I need, the tools, all of that in order to survive.
Right. Yeah. For step one, don't get wounded, right? Stop the bleeding. We're going to talk about the step-by-step problem solving and the persistence that's required to do that in the face of setbacks after the intro. Now, why don't we hit the top, right? Hi, I'm Brian Nutwell.
And I'm Drew Paroz.
And we are on a journey to lead wisely, to become better leaders by touring fantastic worlds and inspiring lore by going on a WonderTour.
We connect leadership concepts to story context because it sticks to our brains better. You can find out more at WonderTourPodcast.com or on YouTube by searching Lead Wisely, all one word.
So here we are. We're stranded on the desert planet. We're no longer bleeding. We have the desire to go home. We have no idea exactly how we're going to make that happen. But in order to get there, we are going to have to not only survive, but thrive. Right? We're going to have to look at the resources that we have available around us, and we are going to have to solve one problem at a time. And so, in Mark's situation, right? Okay, once you've got the oxygen problem under control, then the next fairly pressing one is food. And so we get to a big part of the fun of this movie is sort of watching him be a botanist and grow potatoes and the frozen excrement from his fellow astronauts. But again, it's like one little problem at a time. Okay, if I'm going to grow things, then I'm going to need, fertilizer, and I'm going to need water, and I'm going to need a place to plant them, and like all of these things. Like it's, the casting around, like what resources do I have available to me, even if that's not what their original purpose was for, I think is a fun part of this movie, right? But it's a pretty good parable. It's a pretty good analogy for like, yeah, you look for what's available to you and what can you leverage on that. And I don't think he ever has the impression that it's all on him. Like he never has the impression that he's going to like build a sailboat and sail back to Earth, right? He knows that that's not on the table. Like he knows that at some point he's going to have to engage a larger community for this to succeed. But before that's appropriate, he has to take care of himself. Like he has to be in a position where he actually is stable on his own, where he's got some idea, some optionality for the future.
Yeah, and he is consistently taking responsibility for the actions that are within his control, right? He looks at the problem he needs to solve. Not necessarily the problem that is, let's just say the problem that's most immediate, but that doesn't always mean the problem that is going to happen immediately. I know that seems counterintuitive, right? But it's the problem that's most immediate. So at some point, the problem that's most immediate is the one that where there is a misalignment between the number of souls that he is going to have left in terms of food and the number of souls he's going to need to solve that problem. That's the most immediate problem, even though obviously what's going to be most important today is taking care of the food and making sure it doesn't die, because that's going to be a huge issue long term. And isn't that one of the most interesting things about the botany aspect? Like you said, there's a lot of kind of fantastical parts of this story that are enjoyable because it's a sci-fi movie, but the botany brings it really back down to earth in a way, because it's something you can't cheat. It's the natural growth of something in the universe, and he doesn't come up with some magical way to make the food grow faster or to make it yield more or something like that. He just has to level with that growth curve, and he has to work within the constraints that he has. And so that's what he does, and he fights that battle first, and then he, cares for these plants while he's working on other things. And where some of the other things where you're like, somehow we've jumped from cameras that can look at each other to, oh, now we patched it into the rover and now we're like IMing back and forth and stuff. That's a little bit more of a shortcut.
Yeah. Well, yes. Okay, so you're here. So you've taken responsibility. You're taking advantage of your resources. You are, you're doing the hard things, and you're diligent about it every single day, right? So everything's going to go fine, right? That's what happens in this movie. Is everything goes smoothly from then on, right?
Yeah, that's trust the process, right? No, that's not trust the process.
But not so much, right? Right. So then, what happens? the airlock blows up, his face mask shatters, and once he finishes stanching the bleeding again in that situation, he's discovered that all of his potato plants are dead, and now he doesn't have nearly as much sustainability as he thought he did. Right. So I want to talk about his reaction to that, because I think this is a key moment for us in this episode, is sort of how he responds to yet another setback in this already fairly bleak and challenging situation.
All right, so this is going to be one of our micro moments here. Our mountaintop moment where we can see things clearly is going to be something that many viewers may have forgotten if they haven't even watched The Martian in a long time. Brian, we could have gone with a much bigger scene like the airlock blowing up, but instead we wanted to go with the scene right afterwards. So he's taped up this, he's replaced where the airlock was before with this tarp and duct tape, as he continuously has to do with all things on Mars. And then it becomes night, and he has the realization that he needs to see reality clearly, and that he needs to go in and really take inventory of how much food he has left. So he's counting the potatoes that he has drawer by drawer at this point. And once again, this is the only other time in the movie that we see this storm-like conditions, it seems like, after the first time in the movie, right? Where we hear the wind like beating against the housing that he's in. And now, because there's that tarp over one of the entrances, the wind is like, it's almost terrifying. It's like when you're in a storm and the storm is so loud and you can just feel the wind beating against your house. And it just feels like everything's going to shake. It's almost like an earthquake is happening. He has that kind of a moment.
It's a very primal thing, right? It's like, I just need to take shelter. Like, the world is trying to kill me, right? And literally, like, it's dark and the wind is flapping the thing, against the outside of the airlock. And he's just sitting there and he's just counting potatoes. He's like, all right, well, one thing at a time. All right, I'm gonna have to start doing the math again in a different way. I've got a different problem to solve now, but how many of these things do I have, and how long is that gonna last? Right. And that it's clearly, he's not happy. Like, he's not like, oh, yay, I'm going to succeed again, right? He's not hyper confident in this moment, but he's just like, going to do the thing that I know how to do. Like, all right, fine. Start to taking stock of the new situation. What's my new set of facts? What's my new set of resources? And I love that moment as sort of that moment of persistence, even when you've kind of done everything improbably right, and also you're still in a terrible situation.
Yeah, it's these micro moments where you can tell. I mean, like, that's the moment where I potentially felt the most emotion in the whole movie, because you're sitting there and you're thinking, my goodness, if I'm Watney, I just went through so much. And instead of just resting and giving up until tomorrow, whatever, and just saying, like, I'm so screwed here, he's just putting one foot in front of the other, solving the first problem in front of him. And he's like almost shaking in the scene as the wind is blowing against that tarp opening. And yet he just keeps refocusing himself, forcing himself back down to the potatoes, just focus on this one small thing that I can do. And he does the same thing with the food, right? When he's in that vlog and he's thinking, or he's like, oh, NASA told me I have to eat much less food now, so this sucks and I'm out of ketchup. But he just keeps doing the small things that are required. And it's the small things that lead up to the big thing, right? That's the moment is not when he's like, I am Iron Man. That's not it. And then I think we talked about the same thing, funny enough, in Iron Man. It's like that you're building up to be able to have that moment when to be Iron Man, you have to do it, make the decisions, put forth the effort, pursue the mission in the small things before you ever have that big win, that breakthrough moment, like when he.
Right. No, absolutely. I think that's a good way to look at it. Right, is that the taking responsibility is, he does have, as we like to talk about, like, he aligns himself with a mission. Like, he's got a really big picture. Like, I don't want to die here. This is he's intrinsically motivated. Nobody has to talk him into this. Like, he's got good reasons to work really hard. But also he has to do the hard things every single day, over and over and over again, even when they're the boring small things, like, pulling furrows and planting little tiny potatoes, or hauling carts of dirt inside of an airlock. Like, he just does the things over and over again, right? And that's the invisible work behind success, that he models really well, I think, in this. And that's the flavor of taking responsibility, is like, Yeah, he's not gonna sail back to Earth. Like he needs somebody to come rescue him. He needs a whole team of people to do a whole bunch of impossible things on their end for him to survive. And that's what we'll talk about in the next episode. Is like, what does that look like? But in order to be able to meet them, in order to be ready for them, in order to be able to do his part for it, like he's got to take that step of personal responsibility. And if you're in that, like, I'm all alone by myself and I'm going to need some help out of the situation, like, yes, you need to reach out. Yes, you need to engage and figure out how to find a team that you can join, look for the people who rescue for a living, right? But also you need to be together enough with yourself that you're taking steps towards them and not just putting up the shields and not just waiting to die and not just complaining about how it's somebody else's fault, right? But like, anyway, okay, solve one problem at a time.
Yeah. And so I think that's a perfect spot to take us to our practical application. How do we use this? Because I've been thinking about this as you've been talking. And we talked about this on a previous episode of WonderTour, but this idea that when we look at people who, again, whatever your definition, everybody has a different definition of success. But when we look at people who are successful by our definition of success, for WonderTour, we look at people who are serving others, who are making an impact in the world, who are helping others to achieve limit breaks, right? That's what we talk
Yeah,
about
who
on
are
WonderTour.
leading if effectively in a direction, right? If you're being willingly followed, that's a good sign.
Yeah, when we look at those people, you often see the successes or you see the moments, but you don't see everything else that happens. And so I remember listening to John Mark Comer talk on a podcast about that exact thing. He's like, people are always like, how are you so successful? Like, how are you doing these things? And he's like, well, the thing is, it's just a bunch of little things every single day. Like, you don't see them because I don't tell you about them. But the big things are just like the buildup of all of these tiny moving the granules of sand every single day. And
Right,
that's
right.
exactly what we see here with Watney as well. It's like we have to move the granules of sand. You have to be focused on this one granule right here, this one potato that I need to grow. Otherwise, there is no moment where you're able to achieve breakthrough and have the Iron Man moment, achieve the rescue, get the rocket off the ground, whatever it is, the big moments that, all of us remember from watching the movie.
Yeah, the muscle memory of discipline and practice, and the small decisions about doing the things that support the big mission and not the other things, right? Not the easy things, but facing the hard things. Yeah, so that's really good. I think that's a really good practical application. My number one practical application takeaway from this episode was that you should always have duct tape near at hand. Turns out to be a critical factor more than once in this movie.
Duct tape is the number one material in space.
Right,
That's what you
right.
need.
But also on the flip side, from what you just said about the taking personal responsibility, right? If you're in the leadership role, if you are leading the team, if you are in the role of potentially being the rescuer, right? What you're looking for are those people that are doing that, right? The people that are already taking responsibility, the people that are already solving problems at the ground level, the people that are facing the challenges and putting themselves in a position to be helped are incredibly powerful, right? Those are the people who are ready to be helped. Those are the people who, if you reach out to them, you actually have a really good chance of getting them through their limit break, of getting them to a new level, of getting them out of whatever situation they're in, right? And so you can recognize that, you can look for that, you can challenge people, you can encourage them, you can point out what are the disciplines they might need to develop. But when we see what happens on the other half of this movie, right? All of these organizations, all of these people, all of the, all over the all the countries all over the planet, like sort of doing extraordinary things to help Mark out, right? It's because it's a compelling story. Like, we got to go save this guy on Mars, but it's also because they can see him doing extraordinary things, right? They can see that he's doing literally everything in his power, and that's inspirational, right? Like, oh, I couldn't let that person down. I couldn't not put in full effort myself if I see that that's what's happening on my team. If I see that this person's is, despite their suffering, is working that hard. And I don't think those people are hard to find. Like, if you look around, you'll find people that are in bad situations who are neurotic, and people who are in bad situations who are deflecting, but you will see people, who, despite difficulties, because of difficulties, are really thriving, or are at least, coming to work every day and just getting it done. And that's really powerful. Like, that can be inspirational. So you can drive behavior change, you can drive extraordinary organizational change that way as well.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a good point that I didn't really think about. How do you leveraging the ownership, that responsibility that people have to take personal action, and what happens then? Also, I want to talk about kind of going back to our M. Scott Peck quote from the beginning about pain. It's like, well, you kind of got to lean into the pain. That's the last practical application for me here. And for us individually, that might be a little bit different than having to, like, farm in excrement and stuff like that, or, pull
Hopefully,
us.
I hope that my personal path doesn't lead me to the farming and excrement on the desert planet phase of survival.
Yeah, but for all of us, there is that pain. And the natural thing to do, kind of going back to that mountaintop that we talked about with the counting the potatoes after the airlock blows, the natural thing to do is not to want to go back into that pain after you have that traumatic event where the airlock blows up. In fact, he's like thrown through the air, and obviously, I don't know about
Oh yeah,
what the gravity situation is, if it's lesser of a fall or something, but either way,
still terrible
yeah,
experience. Yeah.
he literally goes through like physical pain, emotional, and obviously mental pain given his survival situation, and he has to go right back into it. That's the thing. That same night, after he fixes the airlock, or at least closes off the airlock, now he's got to go back into the pain, and he's got to go face reality of how much food he actually has left. And this is the thing that most humans, especially today, do not want to do. I don't want to do it. I have to force
No.
myself to do it. I don't want to, after I make the mistake in the meeting, after I say something that I wish I didn't say to my wife, or like say it in a tone that I really know I shouldn't have said it in, and I have told myself a million times I'm going to stop doing that. The easy thing to do is just to go off and say, okay, well, I'm going to go out and get a drink. I'm going to go and, play video games. I'm just going to watch a movie. I'm just
It's
going to
probably
go.
fine. Yeah, it's probably fine.
Yeah. The hard thing to do is to sit and think on it, to meditate on, what actually happened, what was the true reality of the situation, and then to work quickly to make that situation right. To go back into the pain and say, okay, if I need to apologize, I'm going to apologize. If we need to have a frank discussion, we're going to have a frank discussion. But what we can't do is have that moment where everybody can kind of, or that moment where you feel the pain and then you run away from it instead of quickly coming back towards it.
Hmm.
Because that builds up, and I mean, there's a lot of science behind this that we understand now, that when we don't do that, that builds up trauma, that builds up this kind of emotional polarization of memories in our head and stuff, which when we go to sleep, it's natural that we're trying to process those memories, and those memories, kind of, the best way that I've heard it talked about is they get locked up. It's really
Right.
hard for your brain to like put those memories to rest, which is why they continue to define us over and over and over until we're willing to go back into it and face the pain.
Right, and they're a lot scarier when you avoid them, right? Like it's just easier. It's a much less of a big deal if you just right away like, "Whoops, that was terrible. I'm really sorry about that. Where are we right now?" Like that's a lot easier than 3 weeks later when you've been avoiding the conversation or avoiding the problem, and then like finally getting around to opening it back up again.
Yeah, and there's like simple ones. I'll give you a really small one that I saw recently. Funny example, but on Sundays, we have Red Zone, right? It's been going for 16 years, led by a guy named Scott Hansen. It's just all the football games, all the pro football games, all jammed into one stream.
Okay,
And they're
okay,
just showing you the highlights of all the plays, basically. But the live highlights. It's not like you're at Sports Center, you're watching it after the fact, live plays. And the whole tagline has always been 7 hours of commercial free football.
hmm
But last week, Scott Hansen, who has again been doing this for 16 years, led off with and here we go with 7 hours of commercial free football. And then it wasn't. And then there have been ads added into it, and the show has changed and stuff like that. And again, it's a small thing, but Scott Hansen is, in my experience, a really stand-up guy. He's somebody who has high levels of integrity, perhaps a magnanimous leader, as we look at here on WonderTour. Again, even though he's doing this funny Red Zone show that we love. But the thing is, he took it on himself to post a 1 minute video afterwards and apologize for it and say, you know what, I can't say that anymore. I'm still trying to give you the best product, but I've always hung my hat on that 7 hours of commercial free football, and that wasn't what it was.
hmm
So I'm going to come out. And again, like you said, it was like the day afterwards. I'm going to say this because
Yep.
I want to get out in front of this, because I don't feel right sleeping at night with just this little bit of friction, this little bit of
Yeah.
pain.
I violated some expectations, and so just going to go jump right on that. Like, okay, yep, yeah, I'm not afraid of it. I'm not resenting it. It's not somebody else's fault, right?
Yep.
Like, not like, oh, well, these are the 6 reasons we have to do this thing. Just like, anyway, nope, this is where we are right
Yeah,
now,
not blame
and
the
I need to,
studio. Not
yeah,
right. It was
yeah,
like it
I
was
just
me
need
who
to,
said the words. So
yeah, no, that's really cool. That's cool. Like, just jump right on it. Like, okay, anyway, yeah, I'm sorry, you're right. This is where we are. And so, yeah, Mark, stumbles back into his rover and he screams and punches the ceiling a couple times. Then he starts typing emails like, yeah, so all my potato plants are dead. It's just like, just like, all right, what are we going to do now? Right. Yeah. So, all right. So we can aspire to be Mark Watney-esque in our trusting of the process of like solving one problem at a time and taking responsibility for solving all of the personal problems that we are encountering to the extent that we can with the resources we have available to us, while recognizing that that still doesn't get us back to Earth. So, despite all that, despite our best practices, despite our effort and our discipline, we will also need to engage our community. And that is more of a leadership challenge, which is what we like to talk about here. But I think that's what we're going to talk about on the next episode.
good deal.
So, all right. Well, thanks so much. This was a lot of fun. We hope you all enjoyed joining us for this conversation. Till next time, just remember, as always, character is destiny.